demonstrate how to perform a two-proportion z-test. In the December 2002 issue of Consumer Reports, Consumers Union reported on their investigation of the presence of bacteria in packages of chicken sold in supermarkets. They purchased both name brand, Perdue, and store brand chicken in 25 U.S. cities. Laboratory tests found campylobacter contamination in 33% of the 75 Perdue packages and in 45% of the 75 store brand packages. Does this indicate that shoppers would be safer buying the name brand product? Well, the first thing we have to do is identify the parameters. Here, P sub P, the proportion of Perdue chicken that is contaminated, and P sub S is the proportion of store brand chicken that is contaminated. Once we have our parameters, we're going to go ahead and state our hypotheses. So the null hypothesis, HO, is that the proportion of Perdue is equal to the proportion of store brand, or P sub P minus P sub S equals 0. And our alternative hypothesis, HA, will be the proportion of Perdue chicken that's contaminated is less than the proportion of store brand chicken that's contaminated, or P sub P minus P sub S is less than 0. Once we've written our hypothesis, now we're going to check our assumptions and conditions. The first one, randomization. There was no mention of randomness in the problem itself, but we're hopeful that the Consumer Reports used randomness when they selected the packages. 10% condition. 75 Perdue and 75 store brands are each less than 10% of all packages. Independent group assumption. Well, here they may not be independent, but what we're going to do is assume that Consumer Reports didn't purchase packages of each brand from each store. Because certain stores might handle their chicken improperly, this could lead to contamination in both, but we're going to go with the assumption that they were independent. We also have to check success failure. Here we're going to use N sub P times P hat sub P is greater than or equal to 10, where N is the sample size of Perdue chicken and P hat is the proportion of Perdue chicken that was contaminated. And we're also going to check N sub P, Q hat sub P is greater than or equal to 10. And to get Q hat, we're just going to do 1 minus P hat. We also have to do this with the store-bought chicken. So with the Perdue chicken, what we find is the conditions are met with success failure. And the store-bought, we find the same thing, which means the conditions are met. We'll now perform a two-proportion z-test. We have to identify our key information. Here we have the sample size of Perdue chicken being 75 and the number of successes being 25. Now the way that I found my successes was I took the 33% and multiplied it to 75, and that gave me 25. And when I did my p-hat, I basically confirmed what I know, which is 33% of the chicken were contaminated. I do the same thing with the store-bought. I'm going to take 45% of 75 to figure out how many were contaminated, which is 34. And then when I do my p-hat of the store-bought, it's 34 over 75, which is approximately 45%. I'm now going to do what's called a pooled p-hat, which is my successes added together, so 25 plus 34, divided by the sample size of each, 75 plus 75. That gives me 0.393. Now I'm going to find my z-score. To find it, I'm going to use z equals p hat sub p minus p hat sub s minus the proportion p hat p minus p s. So p hat sub p minus p hat sub s minus p of p minus p of s. That's all over the square root of p hat q hat over the sample size of Perdue plus p hat q hat over the sample size of the store brand. Now notice that when I plug all my numbers in, that p sub p minus p sub s is 0. That's based off of my null hypothesis that I wrote. And when I solve this, I get that my z-score is about negative 1.5. Now that I have a z-score, I can find my p-value. My p-value is the probability that z is less than negative 1.5, because that's based off my alternative hypothesis, and I find that it's approximately 0.066. Now I can write my conclusion. Using a significance level of alpha equals 0.01, the p-value is low and we reject HO. There is some evidence to suggest that the proportion of contaminated packages is less in Perdue chicken than in store brand chicken. Now here I used a significance level of an alpha equals 0.01 because contaminated chicken is a very serious thing. So that's why I use such a low significance level. Most of the time we use 0.05, but like I said before, you choose your significance level based on the situation. Now that we've come up to our conclusion, we are done. So if you have any questions, be sure to ask.